The auction block was made of raw, splintered pine, thrown together in the mud-caked street like an altar for a profane god. Upon it stood a girl, no older than 12, her frame so slight a strong wind might carry her away. Her dress was a collection of faded patches, her feet bare and blue with cold. She did not cry. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on some distant point beyond the leering faces of the crowd, a place where the degradation of this moment could not reach. The man beside her, a portly brute named Corbin with a waistcoat straining against his belly, held the frayed rope tied loosely around her wrists. His voice, slick with false bonhomie, cut through the chilly air of Salvation's Rest. "Gentlemen, what am I bid for this fine specimen? Young, healthy, strong back for field work or lighter duties around the house. Her father's debts are my asset, and this asset is for sale. Let's start the bidding at $20. A bargain for a lifetime of servitude." A smattering of uneasy chuckles rippled through the gathered men, ranch hands, prospectors, merchants. They were the cowardly crowd, men who knew this was a sin against God and nature but whose fear of Corbin was greater than their fear of damnation. He owned the saloon, the bank, and half the souls in this dust-choked town. The sheriff, a man named Cutler with a tarnished star and weary eyes, stood near the edge of the porch, his hand resting on his gun belt, a gesture more of habit than intent. He was a man with a conscience, but it was a quiet, underfed thing that rarely spoke above a whisper. $20, Corbin repeated, his smile tightening. "Don't be shy. This is an investment." Silence. The girl, Ilara, flinched as he gave the rope a sharp tug, a show of ownership. Her gaze finally broke, falling to her own trembling hands. In that moment, a man at the very back of the crowd shifted. He had been as still as the arid buttes that hemmed in the town, a silhouette of quiet observation. He was tall and weathered, his face a landscape of hard miles and harder memories, carved by sun and sorrow. Dust clung to his duster like a second skin. His hat was pulled low, but it could not hide the intensity in his eyes. He was Silas, a man who carried his past like a shroud, and he had ridden into Salvation's Rest only an hour before, seeking nothing more than a new horseshoe and a momentary peace. But peace was not to be found here. He watched the girl, and in the hollows of her eyes, he saw a ghost, the ghost of his own daughter, taken by the fever 7 years prior. The same fragile strength. The same silent defiance in the face of a cruel world. The memory was a hot brand on his soul. A low bid came from the crowd. $5. It was a cruel joke, meant to insult. Corbin's face purpled. "This ain't a game, you cheap scoundrels. $20 is the price." Another man, emboldened, called out, "10, and not a cent more." "She's half-starved." Corbin was losing control of his spectacle. His authority was built on the illusion of absolute power, and it was cracking. He raised a hand as if to strike the girl, to prove her value through violence. But before his hand could fall, a voice, low and resonant as the tolling of a distant bell, stopped him cold. "I'll bid." All heads turned. Silas stepped forward, moving with a liquid grace that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. The crowd parted for him, sensing a shift in the town's grim gravity. He stopped 10 feet from the block, his eyes never leaving Corbin. They were not on the girl, but on the man who claimed to own her. "Well, stranger," Corbin sneered, recovering his bluster. "You got a name? You got coin?" Silas ignored the questions. His gaze was a physical weight. "I have a horse. A fine Tennessee Walker. Worth $100 on any honest market." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not how bidding was done. Corbin laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "I ain't a livery, friend. I trade in cash. I have a saddle," Silas continued, his voice unchanging, a steady, level thing that gave no ground. "Hand-tooled leather from San Antonio. And the Winchester in its scabbard." Now the crowd was silent, captivated. This was more than a bid, it was a testament. A man's horse and rifle were his life, his freedom. Corbin's greed warred with his suspicion. He looked at the horse tied to the nearby rail, a magnificent animal, black as midnight, with intelligent eyes. He looked at the rifle, its stock worn smooth with use, a tool of a man who knew how to use it. "And that's your bid?" Corbin asked, his eyes gleaming. "My horse, my saddle, my rifle," Silas confirmed. "Everything I have in this world." He paused, and his eyes finally flicked to the girl, a look of profound, aching gentleness that no one else could decipher. For her the air was thick with unspoken questions. Who was this man? Why would he offer his entire existence for a debt slave he'd never seen before? Corbin saw only the profit. The horse and gear were worth 10 times his asking price. He would take the stranger's belongings, sell them, and still have the power to reclaim the girl later if he chose. This fool had just disarmed and unhorsed himself in a town that ate weak men for breakfast. "Sold!" Corbin boomed, slamming his hand down on a barrel. "To the mad stranger for 1 horse and kit." "Sheriff, you witnessed this transaction." Sheriff Cutler nodded slowly, his eyes narrowed, studying Silas. He saw not a madman, but something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose, who had just found something to protect. Silas walked forward. He did not look at Corbin as he untied his horse, pulled the rifle from its scabbard, and lifted the heavy saddle from the animal's back. He laid them at Corbin's feet, the sum total of his worldly life. Then, he turned and walked to the auction block. He reached up, his calloused fingers gentle as they worked the knot of the rope on Ilara's wrists. The rope fell away. He said nothing. He simply held out his hand. Ilara stared at it, a hand scarred and strong, yet offered with a stillness that promised no harm. For the first time since the ordeal began, her composure fractured. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She placed her small, trembling hand in his. Silas's fingers closed around hers, and without a backward glance at the jeering Corbin or the stunned crowd, he led the girl away from the block, an unknown future bought at an impossible price. He had just bought a child's freedom, but in the process, he had purchased for himself a war. The chill of the evening deepened as Silas led Ilara through the town's main street. Doors closed as they passed. Faces peered from behind lace curtains, their curiosity laced with fear. They were a spectacle, a silent man and a silent girl, bound by a transaction that defied logic. He stopped in front of the town's only boarding house, a modest wooden structure with a sign that read "The Sparrow's Nest." A light glowed warmly in the front window. Inside, a woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron looked up as they entered. She was Martha, the proprietor, a widow who had seen her share of the world's quiet tragedies. "Room for 2, Silas said. His voice was rusty from disuse. "1 bed will do." "The girl can have it." Martha's gaze flickered from Silas's grim face to Ilara's pale, haunted one. She saw the story of the auction in the girl's posture, in the way she clung to the edge of Silas's duster. She nodded, her expression softening. "I've got a room at the back. It's quiet. Supper's on the stove. Beef stew." She didn't ask for payment up front. She knew a man who had just given away his horse and rifle had no coin. It was an act of faith, a small rebellion against the town's prevailing cruelty. In the small, clean room, a single lantern cast long shadows. A patchwork quilt lay folded on the bed. Ilara stood by the door, a frightened bird ready to bolt. Silas put a chair against the door, not to lock her in, but to keep the world out. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, a silent guardian. He did not speak, and his silence was more comforting than any empty words could have been. Martha brought up a tray with 2 bowls of steaming stew and a hunk of fresh bread. Ilara ate ravenously, her eyes darting toward Silas between bites. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze fixed on the wall opposite, but she knew he was aware of her every movement. When she was done, she curled up on the bed, pulling the quilt to her chin. Sleep would not come. The terrors of the day were too close. She watched the man on the floor. The lantern light carved deep lines into his face. He seemed more a monument to grief than a man of flesh and blood. Finally, her voice a tiny whisper in the quiet room, she asked, "Why?" Silas didn't turn. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice came, soft and gravelly. I had a daughter once. Her name was Sarah. He said no more. He didn't need to. In those few words, Ilara understood. He wasn't her owner. He was her protector. A wave of exhaustion she hadn't realized she was holding back washed over her, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Later that night, as Silas kept his vigil, Ilara stirred, caught in a nightmare. She whimpered, her hands clutching the quilt. A memory, sharp and cold as a winter wind, was playing out behind her eyes. It was a memory from 5 years earlier. Her family's wagon, part of a small train heading west, had been stranded by an early blizzard in the high plains. Tensions were high, supplies low. One afternoon, scouting for firewood, her father had stumbled upon the aftermath of a skirmish between soldiers and a Comanche hunting party. There was only one survivor, a Comanche boy, no older than she was then, lying half frozen in the snow, a deep gash on his side. The men of the wagon train wanted to leave him. He was the enemy, they'd said. A danger. But Ilara, a child of 7, saw only another child, shivering and alone. That night, when the camp was asleep, she had taken her most prized possession, a thick wool blanket, woven by her grandmother in a pattern of blue and grey rivers, and crept out into the biting wind. She found the boy, his breathing shallow. With fumbling fingers, she wrapped the blanket tightly around him, a small prayer for warmth in a world of ice. She'd never told anyone. She never knew if he had lived or died. The memory was so vivid that when she awoke with a small gasp, the feeling of the coarse wool was still on her fingertips. Silas was looking at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Bad dream?" he asked. She nodded, pulling the boarding house quilt tighter. Just, remembering something. She did not have the words to explain the confluence of past and present, how an act of kindness in her forgotten past felt suddenly, inexplicably important in her terrifying present. Meanwhile, in the Golden Garter saloon, Corbin was nursing his wounded pride with whiskey. The laughter of his cronies felt hollow, mocking. He had won the stranger's horse and gear, a handsome profit, but he had lost face. He had been challenged and outmaneuvered in front of the whole town. A man like Corbin, whose power was a shroud of fear, could not abide such a public tear in the fabric. "He made a fool of me," Corbin growled, slamming his glass on the bar. "He can't have her. She's my property. The debt is owed to me." One of his hired guns, a weaselly man named Pike, spoke up. "So we just go take her back, boss. He's got no gun, no horse. What's he gonna do?" Corbin's eyes lit with a cruel fire. "Exactly. We'll take her back. And we'll teach this stranger a lesson about interfering in Corbin's business." He wanted more than the girl. He wanted to break Silas, to parade him through the street as a warning. He wanted to extinguish the spark of defiance Silas had ignited before it could catch fire in the hearts of the other townsfolk. The next morning, the sun rose on a town holding its breath. Silas knew they were coming. He could feel it in the unnatural quiet of the street outside, in the way the birdsong seemed hesitant. He had checked the room's single window. It overlooked a narrow, dead-end alley. A trap. He looked at Ilara, who was watching him with wide, intelligent eyes. He saw her fear, but beneath it, he saw the same resilience he'd glimpsed on the auction block. He gave her a simple instruction. "Stay away from the window. And no matter what you hear, don't open this door." His plan was simple because it was the only one he had. He wouldn't wait for them to come to him. He would meet them on his own terms. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door quietly shut behind him. He walked down the stairs, his boots making no sound on the wooden steps. Martha was in the lobby, wringing her hands, her face pale. "They're outside, Silas. Corbin and his men." "The sheriff is with them." Silas just nodded and walked to the front door. He could see them through the glass panes, an ugly assembly of 5 men, led by Corbin, who stood puffed up with arrogance. Sheriff Cutler stood slightly apart, his discomfort a visible aura around him. Silas opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp. The street was empty. It was as if the entire town had evaporated, leaving only the actors in this final, grim play. Corbin smiled, a predator's grin. "Morning, stranger. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I've come to collect the girl is not property," Silas said, his voice flat and hard as granite. "She stays here, that's not your decision to make," Corbin spat. "I own her father's debt. By law, she is my ward." "Sheriff, you're here to uphold the law, aren't you?" Cutler shifted his weight, his eyes on Silas. "The man has a legal paper, son. Signed by the circuit judge." "It's ugly, but it's the law. Some laws are an offense to God," Silas replied, his gaze unwavering. "And any man who enforces them is a party to the crime." A flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossed the sheriff's face. He had thought this stranger was a fool. He was beginning to see he was something else entirely. Corbin grew impatient. "Enough talk. Pike, Jed, get the girl." The two hired guns started toward the door. They didn't see Silas move. It was less a conscious action and more an instinct unleashed. He took one step to the side, his body flowing with a lethal economy of motion honed on battlefield Silas no longer spoke of. As Pike reached for the doorknob, Silas's hand shot out, not in a punch, but with a stiff, open palm, striking Pike's wrist with a sickening crack. The man screamed and stumbled back, clutching his broken arm. Jed, the second man, drew his pistol, but he was too slow. Silas was already on him. He grabbed the man's gun hand, twisting it inward, forcing the barrel to point at the sky. With his other hand, he delivered a short, sharp blow to Jed's throat. The man collapsed, gagging and sputtering, dropping his weapon. It was over in 3 seconds. 2 men were neutralized, their threat ended with brutal, calculated precision. Silas had not killed them, but he had utterly broken them. He stood over them, his chest rising and falling slowly, the sleeping giant now fully awake. The remaining men, and Corbin himself, stared in stunned disbelief. This was not some drifter, this was a trained fighter, a man who moved like death's own shadow. Sheriff Cutler's hand, which had been hovering over his pistol, now dropped to his side. He was looking at Silas with a newfound respect, and a dawning horror at what he had nearly allowed to happen. Corbin, his face a mask of fury and fear, fumbled for his own ornate pistol. "You're a dead man," he hissed, his voice trembling. But before he could aim, Silas spoke again, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "You lay one hand on that child, and I will dismantle you. I will unravel you piece by piece, and I will do it right here in this street for all your cowardly friends to see. There is no law, no sheriff, and no God in heaven that will stop me. Do you understand?" There was no boast in his words. It was a promise. A covenant of violence sworn in the morning sun. Corbin stared into Silas's eyes and saw an abyss of absolute conviction. He saw a man who had already died once and had no fear of doing it again. His bravado shattered. He took a step back, then another, his pistol lowering. He turned and practically fled, his remaining men scrambling after him, leaving their injured comrades groaning in the dust. Silence descended once more. Silas stood for a moment, the violence receding from him, leaving only the profound weariness behind. He looked at Sheriff Cutler, who simply gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It was an admission, an apology, and a concession all at once. The law of paper had just been superseded by the law of moral certainty. Silas turned and went back inside, his duty done, for now. But he knew, and the entire town knew, that this was not the end. It was merely the intermission. The siege began not with a bang, but with a tightening quiet. Corbin, humiliated and enraged, was not a man to accept defeat. He couldn't face Silas in a fair fight, so he would not offer one. By midday, his hired guns, their numbers swelled by drunkards and sycophants paid from the saloon's coffers, surrounded the Sparrow's Nest. They lurked in alleyways and on rooftops, turning the boarding house into an island in a sea of malice. The townsfolk, the cowardly crowd, locked their doors and shuttered their windows, becoming silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Their fear was a tangible thing, a foul smoke that choked the air. Inside, the boarding house was a fortress of fragile hope. Martha, her face grim but resolute, had refused to abandon them. She moved about quietly, securing windows and bringing them what little food she had left. Sheriff Cutler had made his choice. He had appeared at the back door an hour after the confrontation, his face set. "He's gone mad, Silas," he'd said. "Corbin's offering a bounty. He won't stop until he has the girl or sees you dead." The sheriff held out a spare revolver and a box of cartridges. "It ain't much, but it's what I can do. I'm a lawman, not an army. But I'll stand with you." Silas had taken the gun with a quiet nod of thanks. He was no longer alone, but 2 men and a brave woman against 15 were impossible odds. He and Cutler took up positions, Silas covering the front, the sheriff the back. Elara, huddled in her room, could hear the muttered threats from the street below. She was the eye of the storm, the prize in this terrible war. She felt a profound sense of guilt, that this violence was her fault. But then she would remember the look on Silas's face, the quiet promise in his protection, and a different feeling would rise in her, a fierce, defiant will to survive. The afternoon wore on, a long, drawn-out breath of suspense. A shot shattered a front window, a test of their resolve. Silas didn't flinch. He just watched, waiting, conserving his energy, his ammunition. He knew Corbin's plan, to wait them out, to let thirst and fear do their work, and then to storm the house under the cover of darkness, perhaps with fire. He looked at the setting sun, its rays painting the dust motes in the air a bloody orange. He thought of his Sarah, of the promise he had made to her grave that he would never again stand by while innocence was threatened. He was a man haunted by a failure, and in protecting Elara, he was seeking a desperate, violent redemption. He didn't know if he would survive the night, but he knew he would not fail again. As dusk began to settle, casting long, menacing shadows across the street, the final assault began. A volley of shots peppered the front of the house. Men began to creep forward, using barrels and horse troughs for cover. "They're coming!" Cutler yelled from the back. Silas raised the revolver, its weight familiar in his hand. He aimed carefully, not to kill, but to wound, to slow them down. He fired, and a man screamed and fell back. But more came. They were at the door, the wood splintering under the impact of a heavy ram. In her room, Elara pressed herself into the corner, her hands over her ears. The noise was deafening, the vibration shaking the very floorboards. It was the end. Suddenly, above the din of gunfire and shouting, another sound emerged. It started as a low, rhythmic thunder, distant but growing rapidly closer. Hoofbeats. Dozens of them. Not the clumsy clatter of shod town horses, but the swift, earth-shaking drum of unshod war ponies. The shooting outside faltered, then stopped. A confused silence fell, broken only by the approaching thunder. From her window, Elara saw them first. They swept into town from the east, materializing from the plains like vengeful spirits. A column of Comanche warriors, their faces painted for war, their lances tipped with eagle feathers that sliced the dying light. They were a vision of primal power, an ancient, unstoppable force. At their head rode a brave of breathtaking authority, his face a mask of stern purpose, a magnificent war bonnet trailing behind him. Corbin's men froze, their petty siege forgotten. Their rifles seemed like toys against the silent, deadly menace of the riders who now filled the street, circling the boarding house, their ponies kicking up clouds of dust that swirled like ghostly apparitions. Corbin, standing in the middle of the street, looked pale as death. His hired army was dissolving before his eyes, melting back into the shadows they had come from. The Comanche leader dismounted, his movements fluid and precise. He tossed his reins to another brave and began to walk, not toward Corbin, but toward the boarding house. He ignored the terrified men as if they were insects. Silas saw him coming. He lowered his revolver, his mind racing. Was this a new enemy? An attack on the whole town? He braced himself for a final, hopeless confrontation. The brave stopped at the porch steps. He was tall, his presence immense. His dark eye scanned the shattered facade of the house, then rose to the second-story window where Elara was peering out, her face a small, white oval in the gloom. The warrior's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled something out. It was a tattered, faded piece of cloth. Even in the dim light, the pattern was unmistakable, a design of interwoven blue and grey rivers. He held it up for her to see. He looked directly at Ilara, and his voice, clear and powerful, carried across the silent street, a voice that was not Comanche or white, but something more fundamental, a voice of pure meaning. "Little sister," he said, his words in the trader's tongue, slow and deliberate. "My brother has never forgotten the warmth you gave him in the snow. I have come to repay the debt." Ilara's hand flew to her mouth. The boy. The freezing boy in the snow. He had lived. The warrior on the street below was not a stranger. He was family. He was the brother of the boy she had saved. The brave lowered the blanket and turned his gaze, now as hard and cold as flint, upon Corbin, who stood paralyzed in the center of the street. The power dynamic of Salvation's rest had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. The world held its breath. The Comanche leader, whose name was Tacony, which meant a black wolf, did not issue a challenge or a threat. He simply walked toward Corbin, his moccasins making no sound in the dust. The remaining hired guns, who had been frozen in terror, now broke and ran, vanishing into the night, abandoning their employer to his fate. Sheriff Cutler and Silas watched from the porch, their own battle suddenly rendered small and insignificant. This was a different kind of justice, older and more elemental than any law written in a book. Tacony stopped before Corbin. The portly man was shaking, his face slick with sweat. He tried to speak, to bluster, to bargain, but only a pathetic squeak emerged. Tacony looked at him not with hatred, but with a profound and chilling contempt. He saw not a man, but a source of poison, a sickness that had threatened the one who had shown his family mercy. "You tried to cage the small bird who saved my blood," Tacony said, his voice low. "My people know what to do with those who break the sacred laws of honor and life." He did not draw a weapon. He simply reached out and took Corbin by the collar of his expensive coat, lifting him with effortless strength. Corbin's feet left the ground. Tacony turned and began walking toward the edge of town, dragging the sputtering man behind him like a sack of garbage. The other braves watched, their faces impassive. They knew what would happen. Corbin would be taken out to the plains, stripped of his finery, and left to the judgment of the unforgiving land he had sought to dominate. It was a fate worse than a quick death, a slow erasure, a return to the dust he was made of. They would not kill him, but they would remove him from the world of men. The column of warriors parted to let their leader through, then reformed, their purpose here fulfilled. As Tacony disappeared into the gathering darkness with his captive, the remaining braves turned their ponies. One of them, a younger warrior with a faint, healed scar on his temple, paused and looked up at Ilara's window. He raised a hand in a gesture of salute, of gratitude, before wheeling his horse and following his comrades. They rode out of town as they had come, a phantom whirlwind, leaving behind a stunned silence and the scent of sage and ozone. The siege was over. The tyrant was gone. Sheriff Cutler let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Silas. "I reckon the law in this town just got a serious revision." He holstered his pistol, the symbol of an authority that had proven utterly inadequate. Down the street, lights began to appear in windows. Doors creaked open. The cowardly crowd, now brave in the wake of a power they could not comprehend, emerged from their homes. They looked at the shattered glass and splintered wood of the boarding house, then at Silas, the quiet stranger who had refused to bend. Martha came out onto the porch, her face streaked with tears of relief. She went straight to Silas and put a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas didn't reply. He only nodded, his gaze going up to the second-story window. A moment later, Ilara came down the stairs. She walked slowly, hesitantly, out onto the porch. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, at the sheriff, at Martha. Then her eyes rested on Silas. She walked to him and, without a word, wrapped her small arms around his waist, burying her face in his dusty coat. For the first time in 7 years, since the day he had buried his Sarah, Silas felt the rigid wall around his heart begin to crumble. He slowly, hesitantly, raised a hand and rested it on her hair. It was a gesture of protection, of belonging, of a future he had never thought he would have. He had ridden into Salvation's Rest a haunted man, seeking nothing. He would ride out a redeemed one, with everything to live for. The next morning, they left town. The townspeople, their shame giving way to gratitude, had collected money, buying back his horse and gear from Corbin's abandoned saloon. Sheriff Cutler handed him the reins. "The town owes you," he said simply. Silas swung himself into the saddle, the familiar feel of the worn leather a comfort. He reached down and lifted Ilara, settling her in front of him. She was not his property, not his servant, not a ghost of his past. She was his charge, his partner in this new, unwritten chapter. As they rode out, leaving the now aptly named Salvation's Rest behind, the sun broke over the eastern buttes, bathing the plains in a clean, golden light. Silas looked down at the girl, who was gazing ahead at the open horizon, her face filled not with fear, but with a quiet, resilient hope. He had bought her freedom with all he had, and in return, her small act of kindness from a lifetime ago had reached across the years to deliver them both. The hole in his soul was not gone, but it was no longer an abyss. It was beginning to fill with a light he had long thought extinguished, the quiet, steady light of purpose.